Hello, everybody. Over the last few months, we've done shows with an extremely interesting series of new books out. The shortest history of one or two things. They have everything from China to democracy to England to Europe to France to Germany. We've done shows in the past about the shortest history of Israel and Palestine. That's perhaps not the best way of describing the history of Israel Palestine, more like tragic. We've also done one on the shortest history of sex. Some people might like that one to be a little longer. But the shortest history we're discussing today, the shortest history of eugenics, some people might say they wish there wasn't a history at all. It's an interesting subject, an important subject, a very controversial one. And I have one of the world's leading authorities on eugenics for all his sins, Erik L. Peterson from the University of Alabama near Tuscaloosa to discuss it. He's the author of the book. I was going to call you Tuscaloosa, Erik. Erik, what did you do in a previous life to deserve to study eugenics?
I know, right? Nobody picks up a subject like this because they want a light Christmas reading, despite the book launch date. I'm a historian of science and medicine, and this is the kind of dark world that I stir the pot in, apparently.
Yeah, some uncharitable types, Erik, might be watching this and thinking, oh, that guy's in Alabama. Surprise, surprise. Any connection?
No, I mean, I'm a Chicagoan by birth.
Well, I don't mean it in that sense, but would it be fair to say that the idea, the promise, the seduction, perhaps the shame of eugenics is particularly popular in cultures like perhaps Alabama, where there's an enormous amount of racial tension?
That's an excellent way to put it. And I would like to say that, yes, somehow Alabama was especially evil in one way or another. We often associate this state with the worst parts of the pre-civil rights movement. We forget about the best parts of the civil rights movement that also took place here. But in reality, eugenics is something that's been practiced in many Anglo parts of the world, really since the 19th century. The state in the United States that did the most eugenic sterilizations is your own California, liberal though it pretends to be. The second most sterilizations in the United States was in Virginia, especially the area right around Washington, D.C. So it's not something that's segregated to one particular area of the country. In fact, in some ways, the southeastern part of the United States had such terrible racial tensions that eugenics wasn't even seen as something that was necessary until later in the 20th century, when North Carolina, among other places, became one of the leading places where eugenic sterilizations took place. And that wasn't until the middle of the 20th century, well after the Nazi period.
Well, it's a short, sharp response to a dumb question from me. But before we even get to your shortest history of eugenics, let's define what it is, because in a little bit of research I did, I mean, eugenics existed before the modern age. So what does the term mean? Where does it come from?
Well, the word eugenics itself, and I'm glad you pulled up that definition, was coined by Francis Galton before he became Sir Francis Galton. We usually have to insert the spicy little detail that Francis Galton was the cousin of Charles Darwin. And it was after reading some of Darwin's work that he began to be interested in the notion that things like intelligence, talent of various kinds can travel through families. He obviously believed that he was talented, being a member of the Darwin family.
Well, they were a smart lot. I mean, Darwin had some remarkable relatives.
No question, especially when you marry into the Wedgwoods and you have...
And the Huxleys. I mean, this was a scientific aristocracy.
Absolutely. And wealthy, which helps a lot.
And good looking, long sideburns.
That's right. So Galton coins the term, but I think one of the reasons why Galton goes to a Greek term to describe this practice of essentially controlling reproduction is because he's read his Plato. Plato describes the practice of eugenics 23 centuries ago, not the modern practice of sterilizing the unfit. Plato obviously didn't talk about fitness at all, but Galton was a classics and mathematics man at Cambridge before he ever got interested in controlling human breeding. So I think it's just a kind of a coincidence that he decided to pull this ancient Greek word out of the dustbin and bring it back and slap it on this practice that he thought should be practiced in the Western world in order to improve society.
Before we get to the 19th century and Galton, Erik, I assume that maybe the word wasn't always used, but there've always been theories around of people who believe that the color of one's skin, one's religion, one's family, one's region, one's village, one's city made one superior somehow.
Absolutely. That notion, I mean, the stickiness of traits and how well they determine one's behavior through one's life is obviously a very old idea. The book of Genesis talks about kinds of things and sort of dictates the behavior of a thing based on its kind. So that kind of determinism, that essentialism, is not new to the 19th century. I think what takes a turn is the desire to push back against the 19th century notion that education or social welfare could in fact improve society. So a lot of the early adopters of the eugenic language in the 19th century, before it was even called eugenics, were those that were pushing back against the notion that education or improved social conditions could actually make society better.
You note that Sir Francis Galton, British 19th century British aristocrat, relative of Darwin, was the modern champion of eugenics. Is it coincidental that this came out of 19th century Europe, which was in the process of colonizing Africa, carving it up, and that the white man, so to speak, was seeking scientific proof, again,
I think you answered your own question. That's a great
for their own justification for ruling these people?
Right. I mean, what I think is pretty interesting about even the way that you phrased that question is that Galton himself goes on safari in a part of South Africa that we now call Namibia. He traverses the Namibian desert with about 24 servants and other gatherers, and he comes back in 1851 to England and becomes convinced that these racial differences, and by race he means everybody who lives in Africa would be part of one race, everybody who lives in Europe would be part of another race. He also used the word stirp or lineage or root to describe these 5 different groups. And Galton is already convinced by 1851 that there are pretty dramatic and essential differences between people of different skin colors. Again, he's not alone in thinking that. It's just that he had free time on his hands and a love of quantifying things, and also became obsessed with intelligence of different groups. So already by the 1860s, he's laying out his very racially distinct intelligence rankings between groups. Yeah, and I think it's, as you pointed out, it's not a coincidence that all of this was being done with the scramble for Africa sitting in the background.
And this, again, I guess I'm not an expert on the history of quote unquote race, but the discovery of race by Europe. I mean, this was not something that always existed, this European idea or perhaps even invention of race.
Ta-Nehisi Coates says it best that racism sort of invented race. Slavery was the thing that made race need to be a scientific category. You don't really find scientific categories of race much before the 19th century. And over the course of the early 19th century, it became a more and more solid idea, often tied to skull sizes and shapes. It didn't necessarily mean just because you believe that there were different races, that people were so separate from one another that they constituted almost separate species. But over the course of the 19th century, that notion also became more and more solid. It was called polygenism, as if each race came from a different set of prehistoric ancestors. And it was particularly strong in the United States, even when in other parts of Europe, monogenism, the notion that we all have common descendants, was often much more common. In fact,
did it get used, Erik, by defenders of slavery in the United States?
It absolutely did.
Before and during the Civil War as a justification for slavery?
It absolutely did. In fact, and this is where your initial question really strikes home, one of the biggest proponents of the notion of polygenism, that each race had its own set of ancestors and that human beings are not really related across race, was a man named Josiah Clark Knott, who came from Alabama. He was a physician here, and he got a lot of his ideas actually from France, but he popularized them as defenses of what was called the mudsill theory, which is that civilization stands like a building on top of a mudsill or a slab, and that slab is only constituted by people who are not white, and they do all of the laboring so that civilization can sit up on that society. So yeah, it was absolutely a scientific justification for the already existing exploitation of non-whites all across the planet.
Erik, before we went live, you kindly remarked that you read one of my books, Cult of the Amateur, which has nothing to do with this at all, except that I wonder whether some of the early champions of eugenics, people like Francis Galton, were themselves sort of scientific aristocratic amateurs with some bizarre ideas at the back of their mind and used their knowledge of science to justify what they believed in the first place. In other words, let me rephrase the question. Was the rebirth or the birth of eugenics in the 19th century, both in the US and Europe, was it championed by real scientists or by guys who thought they were scientists?
Was Charles Darwin a real scientist?
He was. I mean, was Darwin a eugenicist?
I mean, Darwin shared a lot of similar views with his cousin Galton. I think in Europe, anyway, it would be fair to classify all these people as gentlemen scientists.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, to Darwin, again, anything but an expert on him. But I guess you could argue it both ways. I mean, he was a gentleman scientist, but also the father of modern science.
I mean, a lot of these guys, I think it's the lines between what we would think of as a professional scientist and an amateur scientist were just too blurry to say which side of the line they laid on, especially in the first probably 2/3 of the 19th century. But that's the situation in Europe. And as we get closer to the 20th century, more and more of these ideas get tied up with what in 1906 will be called genetics. And then I think we could argue that's a modern science. But in the United States, a lot of the same ideas were not necessarily held by professional scientists because there just weren't that many professional scientists in the United States, aside from physicists. It was really held by people who worked in the medical fields. So a lot of independent physicians held these views also independently of any knowledge of what Galton or Darwin or any other European scientist was saying about them.
And to what extent in the 19th century, some of our viewers and listeners will know the work of Joseph Chamberlain, how much of these ideas were used as an excuse for one kind of political manifesto or another? This is, of course, before the First World War, before Nazism, and we'll get to that later in this conversation. Yeah. But did they become part of a kind of a public discourse, where people, I mean, this was pre-Nazism, pre-gas chambers. So this stuff wasn't considered, and I want to get to its critics as well, but this stuff wasn't considered pure evil in the 19th century, was it?
I mean, some people would not think of it as pure evil in the 21st century, but yeah, I think in the 19th century, you get people like Count Gobineau in France, who...
One of the fathers of fascism as well, certainly a certain kind of fascism.
So Gobineau writes a 4-volume work called On the Inequality of the Races, and he's decrying in the entire set of books that civilization is going to hell in a handbasket, that it's crumbling, and those views could be used for any number of let's make this country great again sets of rhetorics all the way through the 19th century, the 20th century, and now into the 21st century. If you believe that letting certain people reproduce and have more of them on the planet is going to make the whole planet go to hell, then you can come up with lots and lots of political activities that you can do to try to prevent that, because you think that the cost of allowing more of these sorts of people is just so great.
Although, to be fair, Erik, this is a controversial subject, but nationalism and eugenicism, they're entirely different things. I mean, you can be a nationalist and not believe any of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are detachable ideas. But I think what's important about what you just asked is, could you not take any set of political commitments, borrow this language of degeneration, then borrow the technique of not allowing some people to reproduce and make that fit into your political story? And yeah, people on both sides of the political spectrum have been able to do that in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, and arguably, although I'm a historian, not a political scientist, but arguably that's even happening in the 21st century.
Eric, looking back, you're a historian and you know this a million times better than I do. Looking back, it's always easy with hindsight to be wise. But were there 19th century critics who, no one could have imagined, I don't think there was anyone in the 19th century who imagined the gas chambers, but were there 19th century thinkers, scientists, moralists, politicians, writers, who recognized that this was a profoundly, almost a uniquely dangerous idea, particularly in association with the power of European industrialization and military might?
If colonialism was acceptable, then any ideas that circulated around colonialism became somewhat palatable. So if you think that you can just go and land in some part of the world and just claim it for your own, then there's a lot of other things that are also excusable. Were there people that were critical of colonialism? Absolutely. Were there people that were critical of attempting to change breeding patterns in different populations? Absolutely. There were critics up and down the line. But how many were there and how powerful were there? They weren't that many, and they weren't that powerful. The weight was definitely on the other side of the political spectrum. Now, that might lead us to believe, well, then any sets of past ideas can sort of be morally justified. We can't blame people for holding these sorts of views, even though we think that they're abhorrent. But the point is that there actually were people arguing against it, arguing that it was a moral evil, and those just weren't the people that were being listened to.
And who were they? Would you look on the left at, I don't know, Rosa Luxemburg, socialists, communists, or were scientists, mainstream scientists, maybe other descendants of Darwin, horrified by this idea?
That's great that you brought that up. Even T.H. Huxley himself, by the 1890s, famously in a lecture called Evolution and Ethics, said that, look, the point is not to instantiate the evolution trend of eliminating the weak. The point is to fight against that. That's what actually separates us, says Huxley, a strong materialist, not somebody that's going to move towards some sort of spiritual mumbo jumbo. Huxley thought, look, we actually have to push back against this. We can't just assume that might makes right.
And of course, eventually there was a Huxley who wrote Brave New World, where some of these ideas were being used as a warning against scientific optimism. So we get to the First World War, this terrible killing field, Eric, in which supposedly this superior civilization, where they destroyed an entire generation of young men. Didn't this have any impact on the eugenicists? Didn't they suddenly think to themselves, well, if we Europeans are so superior, why are we killing ourselves?
What's interesting, that's a great question. What's interesting about that is that you definitely get people that are asking questions about racial superiority and progress, right? And we talk a lot about that in literature. The eugenicists themselves, though, saw World War I as a sort of anti-eugenic war. It killed off the strong. It sent the most able-bodied off to war to be maimed. So the rest of society was getting weaker. So they saw that then as justification to intensify eugenic program. It didn't really kick off in Britain, but in countries like Germany, famously, but especially in the United States, World War I becomes an excuse to actually intensify the eugenics movement, not necessarily a comeuppance for this idea of progress, except in literary circles, with one major exception, and that major exception being H.G. Wells, who sort of thought that, eugenics is in fact the way that we should go. This is the only way to make society better, and it's the only way to prevent wars like this from happening in the future. We just need a better class of people to be in charge.
And I think in some ways, Huxley was satirizing Wells in Brave New World.
Absolutely.
How did this play out on because we're going to come up to the period after the First World War in a second, but how did this play out in gendered terms? Was there a theory of eugenics when it came to gender and sexuality, two of our most fashionable concepts these days in the 21st century, or did people leave gender and sexuality out of it?
No, I mean, yeah, obviously that is a key determinant of who gets treated in what particular way. And you can see a change over time. And this is where our definition of eugenics, it gets really fuzzy. If we're talking about the scientific ideas that come from Galton, there's one set of trajectories. But if we're talking about American physicians and what American physicians are practicing, you get another story when it comes to gender. At first, American physicians, before they called it anything like eugenics, were completely comfortable sterilizing, they use the term asexualizing, aggressive men that seem to have criminal tendencies. That was already a regular practice in the United States in the middle of the 19th century, before we ever attach any eugenic terminology to it. By the time we get to the World War I era, it's about balance. There's about the same number of men being sterilized as women, but over time it becomes more and more of a practice that affects women rather than men for the most part. Now there's exceptions because of the pockets of the world that we're talking about, but by the time we get to the mid 20th century, eugenics practices are engaging almost exclusively women rather than men.
Yeah, and sexuality is an interesting one. I mean, I don't know what the thinking was behind the British laws on homosexuality, but the treatment of Alan Turing during the war on Nazis, which probably more than any other individual, he contributed more to actually winning, also speaks perhaps of the way in which ideas of eugenics were implicitly integrated into the culture and law of all these societies.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart comment. You absolutely saw heteronormativity be enforced even in the surgical room. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many more women being affected by eugenic laws and eugenic practices as we go on in the 20th century, is in part a kind of enforcement of what we'll call Anglo middle class or upper middle class motherhood. And those that defy that for whatever reason are often the ones that are subject to incarceration in asylums, and in very many cases, hysterectomies.
Yeah, and the violence of the state. I mean, you're a historian. I'm sure you're all too familiar with the work of Michel Foucault. Maybe
right.
He's a little too fashionable these days, but he was onto something in some of this stuff, wasn't he?
Sure. I mean, Birth of a Clinic is a great book. It's true. A way of seeing a person and their body, and the way of medicalizing a particular set of treatments, is absolutely a feature of the 19th century, and eugenics itself. That's sort of how it keeps moving. People that have a particular kind of medical training can only see, if we're going to use Foucault's language, can only see a body in a certain set of ways. And so the solutions that they're going to bring to social problems often have scalpels or pills as the method by which they're going to bring these solutions to social problems.
And then science becomes a weapon, or establishment science becomes a weapon.
I mean, arguably, anything that can be made into a weapon. Not any, especially just.
I didn't use the word weaponize, Eric. I hate that word, but that's probably what I meant. Yeah, it's a remarkable story, and a very chilling one. On the left, of course, there were theories of historical materialism developed maybe not so much by Marx, but some of Marx's less sophisticated acolytes. What about eugenicists? Did they have a kind of theory of historical materialism? Because I would have always guessed, as a rank amateur here, that historical materialism would make sense of eugenics, in the sense that if the European aristocracy between 1914 and 1918 destroyed themselves, then doesn't that prove their inferiority?
I hadn't thought about that before. Okay, so some of the eugenicists, who were often middle-class professionals, were anti-upper class. So they absolutely believed that there was a kind of eugenic determinism to that group of people no longer having the sort of wealth and power that they already had. But it's not like they then thought the proletariat should rise up.
I didn't mean it so much in those terms. I simply meant that whatever happens and proves whoever comes out on top is proven to be superior. I mean, there's an almost kind of Nietzschean element here in eugenics, isn't it? I mean, how else does the theory of eugenics, and I use that term generously because I'm not sure there really is one, but how else can it be justified?
I mean, they didn't like war. They didn't necessarily think that.
They didn't like war, but they liked they liked their own violence, didn't they?
I mean, okay, let's instead of using the pronoun they, let me be more specific and say that a lot of scientific theorists, especially in Europe, definitely saw war as dysgenic. They thought it was bad. And they thought the ultimate goal should be to try to prevent war. And the only way to do that is to get right-thinking people to be the people that had power and influence and wealth in Europe. In the United States, there was much less of an organized theory about what anything should look like coming out of World War I. Instead, it was individual practitioners saying, look, I don't want society to go to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to do whatever I can on my own. And American physicians, by and large, aren't really regulated. And so they took out what they thought to be the correct direction on the bodies of their patients in many cases. I don't know that they actually even bought into the same set of historical materialist theories as their European counterparts, even if we would lump both groups under that heading of eugenics.
So I want to get to the Nazi experience and
everybody does.
Completely, obviously, discredited this dangerous, what you call in your subtitle of the book, a dangerous movement. But what happened in America after the First World War? Why was this idea so much more powerful in America than in other countries?
You know, that's one of the mysteries, I think, at the heart of this book. And I think the only way to answer that is that in the United States, because the medical profession was relatively untrained and unregulated, they didn't have any qualms about continuing these practices on patients who were inmates of asylums. Whereas in Europe, it just seemed to be segregation of populations was fine, but not sterilization. There were lots and lots of opportunities to begin sterilization programs. By and large, they weren't really begun until 1927. In the United States, Buck v. Bell, it's a Supreme Court case that many people will have heard of. Chief Justice Holmes says that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, that should be enough of a reason to allow sterilizations to continue. There are German scientists who are paying very close attention to that decision in 1927. When Hitler comes to power, they began putting into place what are called hereditary courts, and they begin to adjudicate practices, eventually allowing extermination of what they claim are the unfit in the 1930s.
You mentioned Count von Gobineau. I don't know what that suggests about the value of aristocracy. Anyway, I know he influenced Hitler. To what extent, in your view, is Nazism itself rooted, if there is a core theory of Nazism, and Nazism, of course, isn't really, fascism is different. I mean, maybe Nazis are fascists, but they're different from most other fascists. Was Nazism, in your view, if there is a core philosophy, is it eugenics? Because, of course, it wasn't just the Jews they destroyed or tried to destroy during the war. It was homosexuals, it was gypsies, it was all these other people who they considered inferior.
If there is an Aryan essence, the term Aryan is one that Gobineau borrowed and then popularized, and the followers of Gobineau, Wagner, for instance, also popularized that term in Germany. If Aryanness, the essence of Aryanness, is the sort of substance that should take over enough space in Central Europe to give it Lebensraum, the space to live and grow, then absolutely the theories of the Third Reich are in part driven at least by that notion that there is some pure essence that should be allowed to exist, to flourish, and to push out any other inferior essences. So in that sense, yeah, absolutely, you could say Nazism is eugenic at its core.
Who was the most central eugenicist within the Nazi movement? I mean, Hitler was the leader. We always talk about him, but there were trained scientists. I mean, the camps themselves were in a bizarre, chilling way, an extension of a sort of an industrial extension of eugenicism, weren't they?
In some ways, yes. Eugen Fischer is one of the anthropologists. Alfred Plotz is another one who pushed these eugenic ideas. They were, in fact, in charge of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Eugenics, Racial Hygiene in Berlin and elsewhere. The notion of the camps, though, came from the German extermination camps in Namibia, the same place that Francis Galton was in the 1850s. And they just sort of exported it from Africa to Central Europe. But the eugenic ideology that was preached as justifying why to exterminate people, why to put them in camps, that did come from at least those two figures. There were many, many others. They had picked up the eugenic language from the United States. They had actually read the works of people like Harry Laughlin, who had written a model eugenic sterilization law that didn't ever really get put into practice, though a version of it was at use in Virginia, justifying the sterilizations in Virginia. The Nazis took that model sterilization law and built out the sort of ideal justice system. We'll put quotes around the word justice, but they built out an ideal system of courts and legal proceedings to then begin this process of at first sterilizing or incarcerating who they called the unfit. Some were unfit for racial reasons, some were unfit for mental disabilities or physical handicaps. And then they continued to extend out who they would wrap up in that those more and more cruel practices until they reached what would later be called Action T4. And that was, I tell my students, that was the Holocaust before the Holocaust, where they exterminated hundreds of thousands of men and women who they considered to be unfit. And that was prior to the actual putting of people in concentration camps and exterminating them in those concentration camps using Zyklon gas, largely. All that was done on the unfit before it was ever done in concentration camps.
And then what about the role of, and again, I use these terms carefully, the scientist or Dr. Mengele and others like him who supposedly experimented on the people, especially Jews, but disabled people, homosexuals who were sent to the camps?
Yeah, Mengele was definitely doing things that he had read elsewhere. He tried to do twin studies, usually on Jewish incarcerates of the concentration camps, often children. Those twin studies were things that he had read about in the work of Francis Galton and had been practiced repeatedly in Britain and the United States. He was putting to work in a very horrible way, but he was putting to work things that others had already been expressing for decades at that point.
But wouldn't it be fair? I mean, Erik, it's like the people who argue that inevitably out of Marx's humanism, you get Stalin's mass murder. I mean, was there anything inevitable from Galton's rather, I don't know what you would call it, sort of absurd ideas to the mass murder, the industrial death camps in Germany in the 1940s?
I mean, hopefully you're never going to get a professional historian to say that anything in history is inevitable. However,
certainly that.
These ideas had been out there and had been discussed for a long time. Mengele wasn't inventing anything by actually putting them into practice in Auschwitz. In fact, his mentor, Ottmar von Verschuur, was not in any particular camp, but was in constant correspondence with Mengele. And after Mengele escapes, he escapes the Allies. He goes famously to South America, where he holes up for a long time, never comes to justice necessarily. Ottmar von Verschuur actually received many of the samples from Mengele's lab and proceeded to have a decent scientific career after the close of the war in Austria. and published papers using some of the data that he got, probably, we think, from Mengele's lab, from those twin studies. Anyway, that doesn't answer your question about inevitability. It's just that a lot of these ideas were already floating out there, and a lot of these experts were reading them, passing them between each other, thinking, hey, this would be a great opportunity to actually act on some of these ideas, since we have a captive population that we don't really even consider worthwhile. So we don't care actually what happens to them. We just want the data. And the data was never scrubbed or accounted for. Famously, there were brains of individuals that were exterminated in the camps still floating around in scientific laboratories in Central Europe well after World War II. Again, that doesn't answer anything about inevitability of any of these ideas.
No, I take your point. I mean, you call these people experts. I mean, you don't need to be an expert to make the argument that it was, quote unquote, Jewish scientists like Oppenheimer and Einstein who actually defeated Nazi Germany, or certainly won the war for the West. Was any of this rooted, I mean, by the time of what you're describing now, whether it was in the US in the 20s or 30s, or certainly in Germany in the 30s and 40s, was any of this rooted in something that we can call science, or is it just mumbo jumbo?
What's the it? Is it the idea that talent goes through family lines, or bad traits go through family lines? What's the it that we're questioning?
Well, you don't have to be a eugenicist, do you, to believe that kids inherit some of the qualities and imperfections of their parents?
Absolutely. We'd call that science, right? So when does it stop becoming science?
Well, you're the expert. I mean, at what point does eugenics become eugenics rather than just something that people throughout history have assumed and taken for granted?
I think when we begin to have practices where people that have power and resources control the reproduction of people who don't, that's when it becomes eugenics. And that was happening in Germany, and that is an especially horrific case of this, but it was happening in the United States before it. It was happening in Britain, though not to the same degree. It was happening in France. It was happening in Italy. Then it went to Japan and China and Argentina and Australia and Canada. Most countries I shouldn't say most, a large number of wealthy and powerful countries in the world orchestrated at some point a program where somebody somewhere that had power, influence, whether it was the state, whether it was some other non-state actor that had power, was able to control to a certain degree, at least influence the reproduction of people who did not have that power. In Nazi Germany, again, that's where all the eyes are on the Nazis as doing the things that are especially abhorrent. But a lot of these practices that seemed to be scientific anyway, we don't like to call them scientific. It makes us feel bad about science, but they seem to follow the procedures of science, and they took place in many other countries that weren't Nazi Germany. So I don't know. I don't know where the line is between science and mumbo jumbo or pseudoscience.
Well, at least you're honest, and I don't think anybody does, although a lot of people claim to. The book is called The Shortest History of Eugenics. You'd have thought that this history would have ended after the Second World War and the truth about what happened. The inevitable consequences, I guess, of Nazism in Auschwitz, and with, I wouldn't call them scientists, criminals like Mengele. Didn't the experience of Nazism just end? Eugenics didn't? People recognize in horror that this was just a terrible, terrible idea, one of the worst ideas that humans have ever created, and it just needed to be ended there and then.
To be fair, a lot of people did. But I think traditionally when we talk about eugenics, we do like to end it in 1945. And we say, we looked back, we recognized we went too far, things got bad, we should never do that again. But the truth is that the same practices appeared again and again and again in the succeeding decades. They even appeared inside the United States among many of the people who claimed that they defeated Nazism and saw what the Nazis did as evil. during the 1930s, in fact, before Action T4 even got started, a lot of these practices had already started to appear under the heading of population control. The notion that there were pockets of the world occupied by people who were not white, and they were having too many babies, and eventually they would replace white folks. Great replacement theory is how it was unveiled in the 1930s. And if whites didn't start increasing the numbers of children that they were having, and non-whites somehow decreased the number of children that they were having, the planet would become browner and blacker, and eventually civilization as we know it would cease to exist. Population control movements were central to US government policy during the Cold War. They continued through the Vietnam War. They didn't really come to an end inside the United States until the 1980s. And some would argue that they didn't even really stop then. They just moved out of the way. So it's not something that governments are interested in necessarily, but some of these practices are still practiced in, well, my argument is still in prisons, especially in detainment camps for immigrants in various parts of the world.
And I know that, intellectually it's very controversial. The Wikipedia entry on eugenics includes some stuff on Michael Sandel, one of America's leading philosophers, who's actually been on this show. Are there thinkers who perhaps accept some of the ideas? They may not call themselves eugenicists in the 2020s, but have picked up some of the ideas and are making them more acceptable in a broader scientific or intellectual sense today?
Yeah. I don't know if you know this. There was a conference that I'm not sure if it actually was held, but it was supposed to be held last year in Austin, Texas. NATAL, I think, is the name of the organization. And they call themselves something like hippie eugenicists or hipster eugenicists, maybe. There are still people, that absolutely believe that white folks are under threat from non-whites, that it is the responsibility of white-colored skinned people to have more babies and to prevent those without white skin from having as many babies. Otherwise, the world will be, bad things will happen in the world. That's one whole string of eugenics. There's another whole string of modern eugenics that goes under the heading of velvet eugenics. And Sandel is one of those people who is sort of in that realm.
Velvet eugenics. And what's their argument?
It's just that humans should manipulate our genomes in order to give us the sorts of traits that we like and get rid of the sorts of traits that we don't like. So if you go back to Plato or Francis Galton or any of these figures that believe that we have sort of essential characteristics that we pass on like a baton from generation to generation, unaltered by the environment, then we clearly would want more of the good batons passed along and fewer of the bad batons passed along. Modern day velvet eugenicists think that we should just go ahead and begin that process of identifying the valuable traits, also the traits we don't like, and making sure that to the extent that we can, that we manipulate embryos to only have babies come into the world that have the sorts of traits that we want. Now, I do want to distinguish between those two strains of things that are sometimes labeled under the heading of eugenics, because one group I would call like the biomedical group, the velvet eugenics group, they are dealing with genomics. They really do think that you can cordon off certain traits and that there are things that should be beneficial. And they will be the first to tell you they're not racist. They don't want to just only have white babies, have more white babies. And then there's the other side, which doesn't necessarily care that much about genetic manipulation. It really does care about the proportion of people that have light skin and like things like civilization or whatever. We want more of those sorts and less of the bad sorts of people. Both continue to exist. I think we're under more threat by the second group than we are by the first group, the biotech group.
Yeah, I was going to mention, and we've done a number of shows in this. We could do another show entirely on this, on the biotech implications. You probably should just get them to reread Brave New World, where
right.
Huxley was a distant relative, I guess, of Francis Galton, was warning about the logical conclusion of these kinds of theories. Also, you talked about manipulating our genomes, Erik. With the advancement of genomic science, I mean, with products like 23andMe, I mean, everybody knows that everyone's a mix of everything. There's no such thing as pure race anymore. So how does that impact on eugenics?
I mean, I'm not in those communities arguing for these things, so I don't know how they understand the notion that we are all mutts. Gobineau, though, going all the way back to the 19th century, Gobineau believed that race mixing in and of itself was at the heart of some of the weakness and the eventual decline of civilization. And those are the arguments that seem to be current in that version of the eugenics world, that any version of race mixing is itself part of the problem. And so what you should be doing, I guess, is having only Aryans having children with other Aryans. That is ultimately eugenics, the kind of bad Nazi eugenics that the Nazis were promulgating, but so were a whole bunch of other societies. And that doesn't take any biotech. That's just a sort of more ham-fisted version of eugenics. But I think that is the one that is more persistent and ultimately more dangerous, even though the biotech one is the one that people freak out about because they say, well, this is playing God. You shouldn't be able to manipulate DNA. I just think that's overblown. I think that's still sci-fi right now. We don't really understand epigenetics, so we don't really understand what manipulating the genome can and cannot do. So again, sure, I don't really have anything to say about that group. Fine. It's the other group, I think.
Well, finally, in terms of that other group, the book, Shortest History of Eugenics, the subtitle is From Science to Atrocity, How a Dangerous Movement Shaped the World and Why It Persists. You're obviously not a fan of eugenics, nor am I, but you know a lot about it. How can what's the best strategy in your view for trying to make sure that it doesn't persist, that sane people say, I don't want to hear this stuff. It's simultaneously nonsensical and profoundly dangerous.
Yeah, Neil Postman, who your work reminds me a lot of.
And Postman's was a great writer. Thank you so much on that.
Postman, thought that really at the heart of all of this was education, and I know that's the answer that everybody gives. But we love to be distracted these days. Most of my students, many of whom are national merit finalists, they're excellent students, they've never heard of eugenics at all. We do not teach this stuff at all. And I think if we want to create a society that is making intelligent choices, then we absolutely need to even talk about the dark and dirty stuff. So just having it out there, just talking more about it, would be a good first step to having people make intelligent choices about how they want the future to work. The other thing I think that is important is that we've heard this notion that society is going to hell in a handbasket over and over and over and over and over again for 2 centuries. Some people think that is just in the DNA, if you will, of Western society, to believe that we're on the threshold of apocalypse all the time. I think that kind of thinking, that there is this moment of collapse right around the corner. And so we need to take drastic actions. We need to find some population to scapegoat to get us out of the apocalypse. I think the fact that has happened so many times in American history and European history, we should be talking about that as well. And when people say, oh my God, we have to do this drastic thing in order to prevent collapse of civilization, I think we should be extremely skeptical about both the methods that they're promoting, but also even the situation that we are about to go to hell in a handbasket, and that somehow that's new.
Well, the value of education is certainly supported in the Shortest History series, an excellent new series, educating people about important subjects without requiring them to read hundreds of pages. Erik Peterson is the author of an important new book, The Shortest History of Eugenics, From Science to Atrocity, How a Dangerous Movement shaped the world and why it persists. Strongly encouraged to read. Erik, I hope you're getting your students to read it. I hope other professors and teachers who watch this will get their students to read it. It's an important subject. Congratulations, Erik. We'll have to get you back on. I think the biotech implications of all this are particularly important. You talk about a science fictional future, although I think science fiction has arrived. So for better or worse, we have to address these issues today. Thank you so much, Erik. Congratulations on the book. Keep well and keep breeding.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I love the podcast.